Imagine a government so alarmed by a hunting shotgun that it sent a formal protest through a neutral intermediary, then went further and declared that any captured American soldier found carrying one could be executed. Picture that, an empire already responsible for chemical shells and flamethrowers, singling out a pump-action duck gun for condemnation. The diplomatic note landed in Washington on September 19, 1918. It read like a provocation dressed in legalese and moral outrage. Why would the makers of modern terror be so terrified of a sporting shotgun? If that image grabs you, stay with this story. It only gets stranger. Before we answer the question in full, take a moment. If you like surprising history told with the grit and irony it deserves, subscribe and you'll see more episodes like this. The shotgun at the center of that protest was not a secret weapon, nor a bespoke instrument of cruelty conceived in some dark factory. It had been designed with the fields and marshes in mind. John Moses Browning, the great gunmaker, whose name appears on dozens of late 19th and early 20th century firearms, produced what would become the Winchester Model 1897 as a pump-action shotgun for sportsmen. Its simple virtues, reliability, speed, and ease of handling, made it popular among hunters and police, and that popularity was exactly what made it so valuable once soldiers discovered its uses in a different kind of hunting men. On paper, the Model 1897 was straightforward. It carried a tubular magazine under the barrel that held 6 shells. Each shell contained a cluster of small lead pellets, roughly 1/3 of an inch across. Those pellets were not designed to punch through armor or shatter bone in spectacular ways. They were meant to spread and to stop game at short range. But numbers can make a weapon look like a phenomenon rather than a tool. 6 shells, 9 pellets each, meant that in the hands of a practiced operator, the gun could send as many as 54 projectiles downrange in the space of a couple of seconds. That arithmetic, 54 bits of metal sprayed outward in a heartbeat, is the sort of fact that resists moral abstraction when you stand in a 4-foot-wide trench and someone is sweeping it. Part of what made the Model 1897 uniquely effective in close quarters was not simply how many pellets it could send at a target, but how it delivered them. The gun's action allowed a shooter to keep the trigger depressed while chambering a fresh round by pumping the forend. In practice, a soldier who mastered the rhythm could cycle rounds in near-continuous bursts, turning the weapon into a high-density, short-range salvo system. Historians have used the shorthand slam fire to describe this behavior. It's a mechanical quirk of the design when used in that way, not a mystical property. For the soldier facing someone in the narrow confines of a trench or a ruined house, slam fire made the pump shotgun behave more like a small repeating blizzard of lead than like a single-shot rifle. It's important to be precise about what this meant on the ground. The effective zone of a shotgun at this range is messy. Pellets lose energy quickly over distance, but inside 20 yards their pattern is broad and unforgiving. In the claustrophobic geometry of First World War trench lines, where a trench might be barely wide enough for a man to turn, where footbridges and traverses funneled movement, and where the next man over was often only a meter or two away, the shotgun's spread could cover the whole adversary while making it almost impossible to take cover. Rhythm and noise also played a role. A pump action worked like a metronome, a sharp clack, a rasping shove of the forearm, another clack. For the men opposite, those sounds became a promise, swiftly kept, that there was nowhere to hide. Why did American officers decide that this sporting tool belonged on the battlefield? The answer points to a pattern of adaptation that ran through the U.S. Army's experience at the turn of the 20th century. Long before the trenches around Ypres and the Somme, John J. Pershing had seen combat where the geometry of fighting rendered long-range rifles and artillery less decisive than close, chaotic slogs. The Philippines and later the border troubles in Mexico exposed American troops to ambushes, jungle clearances, and urban scuffles. Pershing, who was always impatient with doctrine that did not solve immediate tactical problems, had noticed how often engagements came down to a few frantic seconds at very short range. In those seconds, a weapon that could sweep a room or an alley with raw, indiscriminate volume had value that single-shot rifles or bolt actions lacked. Pershing's preference was not the only factor, but it mattered. Commanders who had fought in the tangled make-do wars of imperial policing began to see the shotgun the way a carpenter sees a multi-tool. Not the right choice for every job, but the indispensable choice in tight spots. The army began to ponder turning a civilian tool into a purpose-built military device. That required not only procurement but also imagination, people willing to tinker within the limits of regulation and morality to propose modifications that would keep the gun's strengths while making it less likely to burn a friendly hand or get clogged in the mud. Enter William G. Eager, an army engineer whose practical mind was well suited to the problem. His proposals were not exotic. They were pragmatic changes meant to adapt a sporting gun to the peculiar violence of trench and close-quarters combat. Shorten the barrel for maneuverability, fit a handguard to protect the user's forearm during rapid cycling, and fit a bayonet lug so the weapon could double as a last-ditch pike if an enemy closed. These were minor in engineering terms, but profound in tactical implications. They turned a shotgun into what soldiers called, without flattery, a trench gun, a compact sweeper perfect for the narrow defiles of frontline fighting. The Army's procurement process, influenced by Pershing's endorsements and Eager's engineering work, began to field these modified shotguns in small numbers. They were not universal issue rifles. They were specialists' arms, assigned to troops whose work involved entering enemy entrenchments, clearing dugouts, and operating in urban ruins. The men chosen to handle them were often not raw recruits, but hunters, police veterans, or trap shooters, soldiers who already understood how to lead a moving target and how to keep a rhythm under pressure. The shotgun crew was a micro-unit built for a particular job: sweep, shock, and, most importantly, intimidate. Intimidation was as much a tactical objective as physical destruction. Contemporary accounts and wartime letters make clear that the psychological effect of the shotgun frequently outweighed its literal lethality. In several engagements, enemy troops who might otherwise have fought to the death chose to surrender when faced with a concentrated buckshot barrage. The story of the weapon's psychology is essential to understanding why diplomats later raised alarms. Fear of the shotgun spread faster than its pellets. On the nights when the front lines were most fluid, trenches became corridors of sound. The first hint of an assault might be a muffled scramble, a whispered command, the dull slap of boots, then a pistol report, then the impatient, rasping pump of a shotgun barreling along the trench like a broom sweeping debris into a bucket. Men who had spent weeks enduring shell fire and gas attacks have written that close-quarters work delivered a type of terror different from bombardment. There is no time to think. There is only the mechanical promise of pain and the suddenness of it. That immediacy is what turned an agricultural import into a weapon whose reputation traveled faster than supplies. One of the most telling episodes that circulated among soldiers and in press reports involved an action that became shorthand for what a single shotgunner could do when given narrow streets or a ruined village to clear. Contemporary accounts credit Sergeant Fred Lloyd with an operation that read like the condensed logic of trench gun employment, a man who moved from room to room, using the shotgun to force retreat or surrender without prolonged firefights. The details of that particular incident vary in retellings. Some versions compress time, others emphasize the number of prisoners taken. But the pattern is consistent. In cramped spaces, the shotgun's combination of spread, immediate stopping power, and terrifying sound produced results disproportionate to the number of men using it. Another set of anecdotes that soldiers told each other, and that would later be seized upon in diplomatic arguments, concerned the shotgun's interactions with grenades. There were reports, some verified by multiple sources, of shotgunners knocking the pins from grenades or otherwise disrupting enemy use of explosives. Again, the point is not that the shotgun could neutralize every thrown charge, it is that the weapon altered behavior. Where attackers expected to pocket their grenades blindfolded, they found themselves adjusting their tactics, throwing prematurely or surrendering rather than risk the close, bristling consequence of a pump action in a confined space. This is the kind of adaptive battlefield logic that makes military reformers impatient with doctrine and patient with improvisation. The shotgun did for emplaced, short-range fighting what the machine gun did for static defense. It controlled space. Throw a shotgun into a trench and you shrink that trench to the shotgun's zone of denial. That is not mere metaphor. Contemporary reports describe men raising both hands rather than attempting to rush a position when they knew a shotgun was trained on the entry. That surrender behavior, while morally complex, had an immediate tactical payoff. It reduced prolonged clearance operations and saved time and ammunition for the attacker. All of these battlefield stories, the mathematical brutality of pellets per second, the rhythmic menace of the pump, the hunters-turned-shock troops, accumulated into reputation. Reputation matters in war. It shapes choices before bullets fly. It changes whether a soldier runs into a cellar to die or strolls out with his hands above his head. It changes whether a defending unit holds a pillbox or withdraws because the cost of standing is too close and immediate. And the Germans noticed, not subtly, and not only in the trenches where individual men saw the effects firsthand. From late in the war, there was a steady trickle of complaints. As early as December 1914, German officers and diplomats raised concerns about American use of shotguns, though the particular contexts and prodding varied. Reports flowed back to Berlin describing the shotgun's psychological and physical effects on German troops, and as the war ground on those reports, hardened into a formal grievance. In the German calculation, which mixed legal argumentation with battlefield resentment, the shotgun's capacity to inflict rapid, concentrated harm at close quarters breached the spirit, they argued, of the rules of civilized warfare. How to frame that complaint legally? International law at the time was codified in part in the Hague Conventions of 1907, which included prohibitions against weapons that cause unnecessary suffering, a phrase that has always been slippery because it asks courts and diplomats to weigh suffering against military necessity. Germany chose to invoke that language, arguing that the shotgun's effects were gratuitous and out of step with accepted practice. The rhetorical punch of the complaint lay not only in the alleged injury, but in the identification of a weapon so mundane as to seem unworthy of war. A duck gun, the note implied, had no place among the instruments of modern killing. There is a bitter irony in this argument. The Empire, filing the complaint, had introduced into warfare shells saturated with chemical agents and had deployed flame projectors that turned human beings into walking tinder. In that light, the moral outrage directed at a pump shotgun carried an air of contradiction, an irony that American commentators would not ignore. Yet from the German perspective, such a complaint was not mere hypocrisy. It was a statement about what kinds of suffering were tolerable in a world already full of horror. The German note, arriving through a neutral Swiss channel, did more than protest. It demanded action and menaced consequences. The demand that captured Americans carrying shotguns be executed was a stark escalation. If you are found with that weapon, the Germans said, you forfeit the protections of ordinary prisoners of war. Washington did not receive that demand with laughter. A diplomatic note threatening execution for a category of captured combatants raises immediate legal and practical alarms. It also posed a political problem, how to answer an insult that played both to law and to propaganda. The Army's legal echelons, civilian officials at the State Department, and commanders with fresh memories of trench fights now found themselves having to weigh moral posture against strategic deterrence. The American reply would have to do two things at once: defend the shotgunner's legitimacy and deter any German move toward reprisals that could spiral into reciprocal brutality. By the time the German protest arrived, the United States had already moved toward institutionalizing the shotgun's wartime role. Officials in the armament and ordnance branches had been receiving field reports, testing modified models, and sketching out the administrative frameworks needed to supply and maintain these weapons and their specialized crews. Orders were circling in Army channels: procure, modify, assign. What remained unresolved was not merely policy, but tone. Would the U.S. defend the shotgun by argument, by explaining its battlefield necessity, or by threat, by implying comparable retaliation if Germany acted on its execution threat? The balance of law and deterrence would shape not only the immediate reply, but the wider moral posture of a belligerent newly conscious of its emergent power. Inside the War Department, lawyers and officers started drafting positions. Brigadier General Samuel T. Ansel, serving in a legal capacity within the Army, would later be named among those who framed the U.S. response with a mixture of technical rebuttal and stark reminders of the other instruments Germany had employed. Ansel's argument, as later records summarize it, did not deny that the shotgun inflicted severe wounds. Rather, it framed those wounds in the context of weapons already accepted on modern battlefields. Chemical agents, trench mortar shrapnel, and devices that burned or maimed were part of Germany's own inventory. The U.S. case leaned on reciprocity and on legal precedent. If Germany wished to single out a weapon for condemnation, such condemnation would have to withstand the illustration that many of Germany's own practices cause suffering at least as grave. At the State Department, Secretary Robert Lansing, who supervised America's diplomatic posture in wartime, understood that law alone would not settle the matter. Diplomacy in wartime functions as much by deterrence as by argument. Lansing's counterweight to the German complaint would not only catalogue the weapons used in the conflict, but make clear that any move against captured American specialists would invite a proportionate, if unspecified, reaction. The policy calculus hinged on two elements: the legitimacy of the weapon's battlefield utility and the need to preserve the protections of captured combatants. In essence, the U.S. reply would say that shotgunners were lawful combatants doing a lawful task, and that executing them would be an unlawful escalation, with consequences Germany should not assume it wanted. All of this would be hammered out amid the noise of war. Telegrams between Paris and Washington, officers returning from the front with news stories, the press digesting the outrage into headlines, and soldiers in the field still using their shotguns, because in a ruined village or a dugout, the human calculus of life and death had not changed. The stage was set for a formal confrontation between legal principle and battlefield practice. The Germans had made their claim. The Americans were preparing to respond, but to understand why the Germans felt compelled to make such a claim, why they would single out a weapon so ostensibly humble, we need to return to those frontline scenes one more time. Numbers and law tell part of the story, but the most potent evidence of the shotgun's terror was the testimony of men who met it. Soldiers who had come face to face with concentrated buckshot described a pause in combat behavior that was not merely physiological, but existential. The recognition that, at close range, there is no way to meaningfully counter the weapon without exposing yourself to immediate and indiscriminate force. When this realization spread among troops, it altered not only tactics but morale. That shift in morale is what made the shotgun more than the sum of its parts. It made it a lever that could lift, at times, an entire engagement. In the weeks after the German note arrived, field reports accumulated in Washington. Unit commanders wrote about missions shortened by the presence of shotgunners, about prisoners who surrendered rather than die in shuttered rooms, about patrols that avoided certain alleys where shotgun crews were operating. Men who had been hunters before the war were now valued for their ability to read movement and to make split decisions in confined spaces. The culture of the gun had bled into the culture of war. And yet the very ubiquity that made the shotgun effective also made it politically combustible. A civilian tool's translation into a weapon of war invites questions that cut to the heart of how societies translate private know-how into public force. The shotgun's life cycle, sport to police arm to trench implement, was an archetypal story of adaptation. It inspired admiration for human ingenuity and revulsion for its consequences in near equal measure. That duality is the reason why what the Germans knew, not just the mechanics of the gun, but the social fact of its psychological power, mattered so much. They did not simply complain about wounds. They recognized that, in a technical and social sense, the shotgun changed the texture of combat. As Washington prepared its reply, the battlefield continued to be the ultimate adjudicator of military value. Men on both sides would continue to adapt their tactics, to avoid or to embrace certain risks based on what weapons did, rather than what diplomats said. The German protest, arriving like a legal thunderclap, challenged the US to translate what had been a field expedient into a matter of national policy. The outcome would hinge not merely on law, but on politics, which weapon systems were already in use, and the credible threat of reciprocation. The story was now caught between two registers, the intimate, immediate violence of the trenches and the slow, abstract arithmetic of diplomacy. To answer the title question, what the Germans knew that made American shotguns so frightening, one had to hold both registers at once. They knew the ballistics and the sound, yes, but they also knew the behavior. They understood that a few skilled men with pump guns could change the calculus of clearing a dugout or a house. That close range turned the gun's scatter into a kind of justice that left little room for heroics. Their complaint was as much about the erosion of battlefield norms as about the physical suffering of particular wounds. By early autumn of 1918, with the German note sitting on desks in Washington and arguments being drafted by men like Ansel and Lansing, the question ceased to be merely academic. It became a test of international order and of the logic of retaliation. Would a powerful state punish the use of a familiar weapon on principle, and at what cost? The US response, pending in those days, would attempt to thread the needle between legal defense and the blunt reality of deterrence. The result would decide whether shotgunners could continue operating without fear of execution, and whether the legal boundaries of acceptable suffering in modern war would be rewritten by a small rhythmic pump of a shotgun's forearm. If you want to know how the United States answered that charge and what consequence it had for the men with shotguns and the soldiers who faced them, keep watching. The next part of the story moves from courtroom memos and cabinet tables back into the trenches, where tactics, law, and human fear collide, and where a single decision in a government office will mean the difference between prisoner protections and the threat of summary execution. Subscribe if you want the rest of that arc explored in detail. Washington's reply arrived not as an outburst, but as a careful countermarch of law and resolve. The paperwork was clinical, memoranda, telegrams, draft notes, but underneath the formal language there was a clear calculation. The United States would not allow a category of its soldiers to be singled out for summary execution, and it would not permit the principle of prisoner protection to be eroded by a grievance that mixed battlefield resentment with selective legal principle. Brigadier General Samuel T. Ansel, the Army's lawyer who took a lead in framing the military case, did something tactically clever. He accepted the central descriptive point. The shotgun could and did inflict severe wounds at short range. He did not argue that those wounds were trivial or that the weapon's effects were fictitious. Instead, he placed the shotgun within the wider ecology of modern arms and their painful consequences. If the question before jurists and diplomats was whether a weapon caused unnecessary suffering, Ansell's answer turned the table. So did many weapons in use on the Central Power's own side. The logic was not elegant courtroom sophistry so much as blunt reciprocity. If Germany sought to brand one familiar tool as illicit, the United States would be free to point to many German systems that produced suffering on a similar or larger scale. The point was surgical. Don't carve exceptions when you have a ledger full of comparable entries. Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, added the diplomatic muscle. His response, as contemporary summaries would later record, combined legal refutation with a plain statement of consequences. Lansing's note catalogued the methods and systems that had characterized much of the fighting: poison gas, flame-projecting devices, serrated bayonets, and other measures that opponents argued created particular forms of pain or degradation. The American position did not deny the horror of such instruments, nor did it seek to moralize Germany into immediate repentance. Instead, it implied a simple, deterrent truth of wartime diplomacy. Reprisals against a class of captured combatants would invite reprisals in turn, and the maintenance of prisoner protections was in the interest of all combatant states. Germany had, in effect, thrown down a gauntlet designed to repudiate a specific practice. The U.S. answer refused to accept that gauntlet without exposing the wider ledger of wartime practice. The result was what diplomats call a managed stalemate. The German threat of execution, though dramatic on paper, never ripened into practice. No recorded systematic policy of executing captured American shotgunners materialized. The diplomatic incident cooled without the legal world being entirely settled on a landmark precedent. What mattered more than the textual winner was the practical outcome. Shotgunners continued to operate, armed with a kind of federal imprimatur and the tacit backing of a government prepared to defend its men. That resolution did not end the debate. It simply moved it into quieter channels. Military doctrine, reports, and the dinner-table conversations of officers and enlisted men. For those in the field, the rule of thumb was simple and brittle at once. If the shotgun worked, use it. If it drew too much political heat, limit its visibility. Army procurement continued, albeit with an awareness that the weapon's symbolism could cause diplomatic fallout. The shotgun's life, as an officially sanctioned tool of war, continued alongside a grudging recognition that its very ordinariness made it politically sensitive. Beyond the immediate diplomatic victory, the shotgun story extended in two directions: its operational afterlife and its cultural resonance. Men returning from Europe carried with them not just ribbons and scars, but opinions about what worked in close combat. For American forces, the shotgun's reputation survived the armistice. It returned from the trenches as much as a memory as a piece of kit, an item of folklore that sat alongside other improvised wartime practices. Veterans told one another about narrow streets swept clean by a single gun, about prisoners who walked out of cellars with their hands raised rather than test the weapon's promise. When the world again dissolved into large-scale war in the 1940s, the shotgun's second act began in a different kind of close fight: the jungle and atoll warfare of the Pacific. The terrain was not trenches, but dense puckerings of foliage, coral ridges, and the tight interiors of jungle bunkers. In those environments, where sightlines were measured in paces and the first contact was often hand-to-hand, the logic that had once favored the trench gun returned. Marines and soldiers found the same virtues useful: a compact, hard-hitting firearm that could make a single entry into a hut or bunker decisive. The shotgun did not replace the rifle or the submachine gun. It complemented them in a theater of war where rooms were not lines, but isolated islands. Stories of Marine units privately acquiring and modifying shotguns have become part of that branch's lore. Some of these stories are specific. Names, units, and episodes linger in regimental histories and in the private letters of NCOs, while others remain anecdotal, the kind of thing that circulates in barracks talk. Names like Sergeant Clyde Thomason surface in those narratives, offered as examples of men who brought the shotgun's utility into the brutal intimacy of jungle fighting. Major General Alexander Patch's campaigns in the Pacific are sometimes mentioned in the same breath, not as promoters of a single weapon, but as evidence of a military culture that valued practical tools when conventional doctrine met exotic terrain. It is important to distinguish the faint line between documentary record and lore. Where specific actions are contested or anecdotal, contemporary accounts phrase them as reports or soldier testimony rather than hard fact. The shotgun's medical and moral footprint also continued to be debated in print. Journalists and commentators who had covered the First World War reflected on what the weapon had done not only to bodies but to the rhythm of combat. Peter P. Carney, among those who later wrote on the subject, emphasized the shotgun's capacity to compress time. He and others noted how the weapon condensed the period between contact and resolution, producing outcomes that were at once tactically efficient and politically awkward. For readers, that observation has a sting. A small weapon compressed suffering into an instantly comprehensible spectacle, and that compression forced politicians and soldiers alike to reckon with the ethics of immediacy. A weapon that shortened battles could also shorten diplomatic patience. Historians looking back from a later century have framed the shotgun's tale in broader terms. It is an emblem of adaptation. Civilian technologies reshaped by the demands of industrialized violence. It is a lesson in reputational effect. Fear travels a different bandwidth than steel or gas. Most of all, it is a study in moral paradox. The German complaint against the shotgun rests uneasily against its wider wartime conduct. That contradiction does not vanish when pointed out, but pointing it out does change what the complaint signified in the tangled legal and emotional economy of 1918. The Germans were not merely moral scolds. They were soldiers reacting to a weapon that altered the calculus of their men's survival and surrender. The U.S. reply, blending legal principle with implied deterrence, was as much about preserving reciprocity as it was about defending a single tool. There is another layer worth dwelling on for a moment, the cultural logic of the shotgun itself. Its roots are peculiarly American. The pump-action shotgun, built for marsh and field, is an artifact of a society where civilian marksmanship, hunting, and police practice often overlap. The translation of that practice into wartime utility thus feels natural in an American military culture that prizes improvisation and practical skill. Hunters made effective shotgunners not because they were mechanized warriors, but because they already knew how to read movement, how to judge arcs, and how to make split decisions with a tool designed for unpredictability. That social continuity, rural skill, mapped onto battlefield effect, helps explain why the weapon's reputation persisted long after the immediate controversies faded. And yet, the final answer to the title's central question, what Germans knew that made American shotguns so frightening, is less a single fact than a compound recognition. They knew the geometry of close combat, how narrow spaces amplify spread and make cover a fiction. They knew the acoustics of the pump action, how the repetitive clack of the action becomes a timekeeper of impending harm. They knew the arithmetic, how a simple calculation of pellets per second, compounded by the confined space of a trench or room, translated into a near guarantee of immediate incapacitation at close range. Most importantly, they knew behavioral change. They recognized, perhaps better than anyone else involved, that war is not decided only by tools and numbers, but by how those tools change what men do. If a weapon makes surrender rational where it had been unthinkable, it has changed the game. That recognition is not a moral verdict so much as a tactical observation. It is an awareness of efficacy combined with a political discomfort over what efficacy meant at the human level. The German protest was less a denial of the shotgun's physical reality than an attempt to reinstate a different norm of combat, a norm in which certain types of suffering, even if inevitable in other contexts, were not inflicted by such an apparently ordinary implement. The American counter was, in essence, a refusal to allow a single middle-class tool to be carved out of the rules that governed soldiering and capture. In the end, the diplomatic crisis passed, because war has a stubborn way of making practical arrangements out of ethical messes. Shotgunners continued to do the work they had proven able to do. They were not heroicized as instruments of vengeance, nor demonized into legal banishment. They remained, in military parlance, a specialist asset, valuable in certain geometries, problematic in others, and politically sensitive because their ordinariness made the extraordinary look quotidian. As a final note on legacy, the shotgun's presence in subsequent conflicts, from the Pacific Islands to localized police actions, served as a continuing reminder that adaptation often travels faster than law. Military organizations continued to work out regulations balancing effectiveness and political risk. Those debates matter because they show how law, policy, and battlefield habit co-evolve. Weapons do not simply appear and vanish. They become embedded in the practices and reputations of units, and those reputations shape decisions long after the original factual controversies are forgotten. So to answer plainly the question in the title, what the Germans knew and what made American shotguns frightening, was not a simple hatred of brutality nor an elegant legal argument. It was a clear, practical recognition that in the claustrophobic arithmetic of trench and room, a pump-action shotgun turned time into an immediate crushing pressure. They saw how a handful of pellets, fired rhythmically and densely, altered the choices men made in confined spaces. They understood that fear, once seeded, could be more decisive than steel alone. That knowledge, multiplied across battalions and translated into diplomatic protest, is why a duck gun became, rather suddenly and irrevocably, a weapon to be feared. If this episode interests you, tell us in the comments what other ordinary tools you think have been turned into surprising instruments of war. And if you enjoyed this dive into the odd, ironic corners of military history, subscribe to see more.